Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
So great to be with those of you who are here in room 2425. Love that. And so great to be with all of you who are following us online. As you know, Hanukkah is tomorrow night. And Hanukkah invites us to think tomorrow night. As you know, Hanukkah, first night, is tomorrow night. And Hanukkah invites us to think about the relationship of ourselves and our Jewish identity in the broader culture in which we live, whether it's Hellenic, Greek, Syrian culture at the time of the Maccabees, whether it is our own culture here in America. And we always read the Joseph story during Hanukkah. That's just one of the glories of the Jewish calendar, that Joseph in Egypt, the Maccabees in Palestine during the Hellenic regime, and us in America always converge. And we're going to think about what the Joseph story has to say to us about our own inner life and our own Jewish identity and what it says to us about anti-Semitism. So let us thank God for the gift of learning Torah together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. וערב נא אדוני אלוהינו את דברי תורתך בפינו ובעמך בישראל, ונהיה אנחנו וצאצאינו וצאצאי עמך בישראל, כולנו יודעי שמך ולומדי תורתך לשמה. ברוך אתה אדוני המלמד תורה לעמו ישראל. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר בחר בנו מכל העמים ונתן לנו את תורתו. So one of the glories of learning Torah is that while the Torah portion never changes, we do. And you see something that you had never seen in it before. So I was talking to one of our younger members, and I said, when you think about the Joseph story that we start reading this week, what's a new angle or a unique angle that you see this time? And she offered up that it's actually the origin story of all the worst things that anti-Semites ever say about us. Like, the origin story of the anti-Semitic narrative is actually in the Torah, and I had never quite seen that before. And the thing is, in this case, they're all true. Right? So all the worst things that Jew haters ever say about Jews are actually true in the story of Joseph. So you have Joseph, who becomes second only to Pharaoh. He gets his new name, Tzafanat Paneach. But when the Egyptians are hungry, they say to the Egyptians, Pharaoh says to the Egyptians, go talk to Joseph, go talk to Jeffrey Epstein, go talk to Harvey Weinstein, go talk to, no, the Jew, Joseph.
Michelle, poker face, I told you.
No, lest you think I'm making this up. Lest you think that I'm making this up, it's pretty clear. If you look on page 2, Pharaoh then gave Joseph the name Tzafanat Paneach, and he gave him a wife, Osnat, the daughter of Potiphar, prince of On. So Joseph has an identity as an Egyptian type of person. He's got a new name. But if you look on page 4, verse 55, and when all the land of Egypt felt the hunger, the people cried out to Pharaoh for bread, and Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph. Whatever he tells you, you shall do. Even though he's got a name of Tzafanat Paneach, when it comes time for hunger and hunger relief, go to the Jew. I again reiterate, go to Harvey Weinstein, go to Jeffrey Epstein, go to Bernie Madoff, go to Samuel Boxford. No, seriously, go to the Jewish guy, yes. And then what happens is, let me just make the case. It's pretty clear that Joseph ends up, Joseph the Jew in Egypt, ends up saying to hungry Egyptians, first give us all your money, then give us all your cattle, then give us all your land, then give us your very freedom. Now, here is a great irony, but fortunately, don't blame me. I'm just reading the Torah. I'm not writing it. If you look on page 288 or page 7 of the handout, guess who the first slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt are? Egyptians. right? So, and v'hayinu avadim leFaro. So the first slaves to Pharaoh are Egyptians. All of this is done by Joseph. Joseph has made Egyptians slaves unto Pharaoh. Oh, and then, by the way, it ends with, thus Israel settled in the country of Egypt in the region of Goshen. They acquired holdings in it and were fertile and increased greatly. And just so that we don't miss the point, if you look on page 5 of the handout, page 286 of the text, the entire story of how Joseph enslaves Egyptians, how Joseph makes the first slaves into Pharaoh in Egypt Egyptians, is enveloped by the fact that Joseph makes his Jewish relatives really rich in Egypt. So verse 11, so Joseph settled his father and his brothers, giving them holdings in the choicest part of the land of Egypt, in the region of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. Joseph sustained his father and his brothers and all his father's household with bread, down to the little ones. So when you look at the story, they're hungry, and Pharaoh says, go to the Jew. The Jew takes their money, takes their land, takes their cattle, takes their freedom. And the story wherein Joseph does that so that they become slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt is enveloped. At the beginning, he puts his family in the choicest parts of Egypt. At the end, he puts his family at the choicest part of Egypt. Unless you think that this is some kind of uncharitable read, it's clearly pshat, because the end of Genesis leads into the beginning of Exodus. So just take a look here, and then we're ready to discuss. When we're at the beginning of the slavery story, where we're now the slaves, a new king over Egypt who didn't know Joseph, and he said, look, the Israelite people are much too numerous for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them, etc. And then they set taskmasters upon them to oppress them with forced labor. Vaya'avidu Mitzrayim et bnei Yisrael b'forach. Now the Egyptians made the Jews the slaves. And it's the same shoresh, Vaya'avidu, Eved. So in the beginning, Joseph made Egyptians the slaves, and it didn't take much prodding for Egypt to make the Jews the slaves. So what you have here is an origin story of all the worst tropes. So dear colleagues, first of all, what's your reaction to that? And second of all, what do we learn from that?
I cannot wait for your answer, Michelle.
Yeah, I mean, and Michelle, you were grimacing, but
Where was
I uncharitable?
I was only grimacing in your having chosen the most odious Jewish names of this current era,
right,
rather than thinking about something like they went to Joseph Lieberman. Like, I think there is, like, why not say that actually one could be a Jew who is fulfilling your function in the government. By the way, he's not serving only his own interests. He's serving Pharaoh, right? He's doing something that has been asked of him. Why do you pull up all of the most painful and challenging Jewish names here? There are people who serve with good intention in a government, perhaps even sometimes for means that are not necessarily the most laudable means, but doing so in order to try to save those people, which I think our tradition very much sees Joseph as trying to do, right? All of these things, not only at the behest of, it's not just he made me do it, you know, I was just following orders. He's actually trying to save and resurrect a civil society.
Right, so the reason that I look at Samuel Boxman Fried rather than, you know, a Jewish doctor who heals people, is anti-Semites don't tend to look charitably upon the Jewish people. They tend to look, there's a lot of bile and vitriol, and sadly, there's a lot of targets for bile and vitriol. And, you know, like literally every day this week, the story is Samuel Boxman Fried, Samuel Boxman Fried, Samuel Boxman Fried, when it wasn't his parents, Bankman Fried, right? And so I'm just saying that anti-Semites look at news stories. Who are the worst villains? You know, Bernie Madoff, he made off with our money, et cetera. Harvey Weinstein, Jeffrey Epstein. And I'm just saying this is real. This is real. They don't, and the answer is never, oh, but there's a lot of Jews who do a lot of good things. It's like, wow. And my question is, what do we learn from this?
Right. So, I mean, what you are bringing is such an interesting topic, and it's nothing new. This has been going on for centuries. I always say that I grew up in Argentina. I'm not going to say that today. I'm going to change. I'm going to change and talk about Italy, because I'm leading a temple trip to Italy. Forget about Israel 75. Who cares about that? Come with me to Italy. Anyways, so a couple of years ago, I was in Italy, and with my family, we visit a city called Siena. And Siena is a gorgeous city for those who have been there. And there is a square, and 1 block away from the square, there is a synagogue, okay? And we visit the synagogue. It's on the 2nd floor, beautiful. And the tour guy was telling us that in the Middle Ages, at the door of the synagogue used to be the prostitutes. And anybody who would visit town would go to the prostitutes that were in front of the synagogue. Why was that? Because as we all know, for Catholics and Christians in those days, it was a sin to lend money to other people. So the only people who were allowed to do that were the not citizens of the country, which were the Jews. They were not considered citizens. So anybody would come to visit the prostitute, and I would say, I don't have money. Okay, go and lend money, borrow money from the Jews, and then whatever it's then,
Right.
all right? Anyways.
Your point is.
So my point is that.
Your point is.
My point is, come with me to Italy. Now, my point is that this has been going on for centuries.
What's
There's
the money
nothing
first?
new about Jewish people associated with money, lending money and borrowing money and all that stuff.
So here's my question, which is, first of all, I never really appreciated. Did you guys know that the origin story of Jew hatred is actually Genesis? Like the genesis of the
Yes.
stories that people say about us that are bad are in Genesis. You knew this.
We include it in our Seder every year.
Say more.
So I'll say that, and then I also want to add one other thing, which is, so yes, I remember in rabbinical school, that was the first time I came across this text, and I was at a learning session, a gathering, somebody mentioned this, and I was like, there is no way that exists in the Torah. Like, I've read the Torah, I've read all the, no, that doesn't exist. And they're like, it does, and I'll show you. And I was like, no, it doesn't exist. And I will show you. And then they showed it to me, and I was like, what edition is this? I couldn't process it, and so we added it to. We have a family written Haggadah, and we added it to our story. That the story starts with this moment. But what's been interesting
The
for
moment
me,
where we enslaved the Egyptians.
Yeah.
Where Joseph enslaves the
where
Egyptians.
Joseph enslaves the Egyptians, because one of the pieces that's become important in our Haggadah is thinking about the relationship between the Egyptians and the Jews, and not just in that we enslave the Egyptians and then they enslave us, but also in that we feel their suffering, right? We dump wine out for their suffering. It's not a one-sided thing. We can also feel compassion for those that have harmed us, even as we want to get out and are willing to expend that energy to harm them in order to get out. But what's really interesting for me is that the shot of the text, I don't know if the shot of the text sees the connection. It's so interesting. It goes out of its way to say, Vayakom melech hadash al Mitzrayim, a new king arose, asher lo yada, that did not know at Yosef. And it's such an interesting thing, because as a reader, I would think, wow, there's this period of history where there's this Joseph in charge, and he's the one that enslaves, and he's the one that impoverishes, and he's the one that literally redistricts and busses out all the Egyptians from Goshen, which is the, Cherry Hills Newton of Egypt, and puts in his family. And I would think that story would have been told generation to generation to generation, and a new king would rise up and would say, like, Jews came in and they took our land and they took our, but that's not what happened. Somehow he doesn't know Joseph. He doesn't, and the text, at least the way that most Haggadah tell it, right? The text is that because he didn't know, if he had known Joseph, he wouldn't have done this, but he doesn't know Joseph, and I don't quite know what to do with that. It feels like the text is both giving us a very compelling reason for why we were enslaved, and at the same time undermining that.
Okay, very valid, and I like your take on this. But there is no citizen in the world who is an anti-Semite, who is going to come to you and they will tell you everything started with Joseph in the Bible. Not even one, not even half of a human being. They will always refer to killing Jesus or Christ, okay? And what happened and the creation of the church. So, beautiful rabbinical interpretation, but I disagree.
So
Well, can I
Yeah.
just add there? I think Eliezer, your point is so really helpful because I do think in one sense that yes, people will give reasons for anti-Semitism. They'll say it's because of killing Christ, or Wes, you're saying this morning it's because Joseph enslaved the Israelites. I'm sorry, the Egyptians. But Eliezer, your point is so cogent because it says actually there's this amorphous, like they don't know. Right? It's not that we have this tradition from parent to parent to parent to child to child to child to grandchild that this is the reason we hate the Jews. Like we hate the Jews, right? It's a thing and it's inchoate and it kind of repeats again and again. You know it when you know it, but it's just there. It's
So here's my question. When you read this text, which is in the Torah, which is instruction, which is light for how we should live our lives, what do we learn? What do we learn from this origin story of how to do better or have a better result in our host countries, like including the United States now?
So I have a question about setup and authority. I'm thinking of the Milgram experiments here because I feel like what we don't get is what Pharaoh set up as the requirement for distributing food, and whether or not Joseph was really following authority and felt like as an immigrant and as a first generation Egyptian, or his children are first generation Egyptians, that he really had to toe the line or else he would face serious consequences. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that Pharaoh's like the same way Potiphar was with Joseph, really hands off, and Joseph is like, you know what? I've always been suffering. I've always been on the outskirts. I was thrown into a pit. I've never had stability or security. I'm going to make a difference for my family, and I'm going to do it by taking advantage. We don't know that. And I think that's a really important distinction for how we learn from the story. Because on the one hand, the story might be a cautionary tale about how we relate to situations in which we feel like we have no choice. And on the other hand, it might teach us about what we choose to do with our power, what we choose to do with our resources, and knowing that even if we don't think, Joseph probably never thought that in year one that this would lead to the enslavement of the Egyptians. He was probably just thinking, I want to set up my family. But when we take resources, right, it's not a zero-sum game. We're taking them away from someone. And so we have to think about how we redistribute and how we are seen in the community as generous givers of tzedakah.
Yeah, so just one, and Dan, you're next. I would love your voice. But why do you, just to that point, it seems like that, Shai Held has taught us that you can never read the Torah too slowly, and that you really need to dilate and dwell. Why this whole story about the Egyptians becoming slaves to Pharaoh is enveloped by the fact that the Jews get richer and richer, right? Joseph settled in the choicest part of the land of Egypt. And then at the very end of the story, again, you can't read this too slowly. V'hayinu avadim leFaro. Egyptians are now slaves unto Pharaoh. And it could have ended there. But no, thus Israel settled in the country of Egypt in the region of Goshen. They acquired holdings in it and were fertile and increased greatly. By the way, and the language at the end, vayifru vayirbu ma'od, is exactly the language that Pharaoh uses in Exodus to say these people are vermin, these people are pestilence, right? So the same language of vayifru vayirbu, they increased, they were succeeding, they were thriving, is used in Genesis to say we're really crushing it. And in Exodus, it's the same words that are used by Pharaoh to say we need to crush these people who are crushing it. My question is, what is the Torah telling us? What's the message with that? Dan?
So there are two things. I don't know if there's an answer to your question, because I think two things. I think that the only way that we can be under the radar is to be under the radar. But how do we do that? Because does that mean that we stop that is just because who you are, that you stop being a financial mogul, do you stop being an amazing, groundbreaking tech person like in Israel? Do you stop being an amazing, groundbreaking doctor? Do we just stop doing that so that we're under the radar? If we're under the radar, we're not going to be noticed. And that, I mean, that could be the answer, but how? But I don't think there really is an answer, because that's saying to all of us, don't do what you do. The other thing is, I want to go back to Elias's point, about the anti-Semitism really starting with the church, and so it's an interesting question, because if you think about the church and like the model that you're showing us in the Torah, how do we take away people's dignity and their right to exist? And this model is showing us that in the Torah, but we understand, of course, that the church fathers knew the Torah. They knew it backwards and forwards. So there are texts. I didn't bring them with me, but there are texts from the church, from very early Middle Ages, where it talks about the way in which the church can limit Jewish power by following the story of Joseph. There actually are texts that exist. So they actually did that. The church actually did that. They knew this text backwards and forwards, and they used that same model to cause everything that happened to the Jews in the Middle Ages and forward.
Yeah.
I am I'm of two minds, because I'm sympathetic to your desire to try to take this to be a cautionary tale. What can we learn? How can we grow as a modern Jewish people in our relationships with others? But there's also this piece of me that thinks about who's reading this story, right? And if we take the idea that this was given to us on Mount Sinai, right, a people who are sort of waiting on the edge of our land, or written by whatever your theological construct is, a people who were disenfranchised, and you read back to the story of Joseph, and it sounds like wow, once we were the ones in charge, once we were not the slaves, once we were the ones who had the opportunity to create a world of our own shaping and making, and it becomes sort of the Joseph story through that eye becomes kind of a fantasy of a disenfranchised people to what could happen if only we had the power, rather than what we're trying to make it as right now today as a modern people. Oh, look what happens, or what people say about us when we have power.
But on that, I feel like the same can be said for this is why we don't have power, right? If we had power, everybody would just look to us and blame us for the power that we had, and so it's better that we don't have power, right? In that same
But there's also that narrative that comes out of it.
Yeah, so I want to pause this piece of the conversation. By the way, when you read ADL statistics about anti-Semitism, we're a very teeny tiny percentage of the Jewish people, and we're a huge percentage of the incidents of hate crimes are against Jews. So whatever the numbers are, we're 2%, 1%, whatever it is, and more than 50% of hate crimes are directed against us. So you have this in the atmosphere. I want to turn the lens now, not to the Egyptians, but to Joseph and his interior life. And there's some verses that don't get a lot of attention that I think are deeply rich. And Elias, I want to ask you to what your emotional read is. This is when Joseph, who's married this Egyptian aristocrat, has two sons, and he doesn't give them Egyptian names. He gives them Hebrew names. But, oh my God, he needs a therapist. I mean, he needs a therapist 3 days a week in person to work through his issues. So page 3, before the years of famine came, Joseph became the father of two sons, whom Osnat, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bore to him. Okay. Now, if there's any therapists in the room here. Joseph named the firstborn Menashe, meaning God has made me completely, has made me forget completely my hardship and my parental home. Note to file, if you name somebody for I have forgotten completely my hardship and my parental home, that means you never forget your hardship and your parental home. Every time I call you out, hey, Menashe, did you do your homework? I'm remembering completely my hardship and my parental home. And then the second he named Ephraim, meaning God has made me fertile in the land of my affliction. right? So I never have a blue sky. I never have 73-degree weather and empty skies of wind and rain. It's just always cloudy. It's always murky. Like I'm fertile, but it's my affliction. It's my affliction, but I'm fertile. Just all this ambivalence. Therapists, please. So Elias is somebody who has named two sons and has come to another country. What's going on in Joseph's mind when he names his kids these names?
Wait a minute here. So you are saying or implying that I need therapy 3 times a week.
Yeah.
Thank you, Wes. I liked you up until now.
Yeah.
So what do you want me to answer?
Well, first of all, like, what do you? There's so much I want you to answer. I mean, one thing I want you to answer is why you root for the Argentinian soccer team, even though no, seriously, even though you always talk about the anti-Semitism you encountered in Argentina, why you root for the Argentinian soccer team, even though the JCC murders happened and nobody ever got prosecuted, and how you like all that kind of ambivalence in Joseph's kids' names. Like you literally didn't daven Musaf so you could shout in favor of the Argentinian team, but also just like below the surface, not even below the surface, at the surface is the JCC bombings, and all these years later, nobody was ever prosecuted. And so, how you hold both of those, and I'm wondering whether that kind of ambivalence is reflected in Joseph's kids' names.
How much for the session? um, all right. So let's begin. As I think that you said it once in a sermon, or one of you guys said it in a sermon, that when you Google on the internet, most traumatic experience a human being can go through, it's not losing somebody who is a dear relative or a friend, is being an immigrant. It's moving from one place to the other, okay? With that saying, it's like you live your whatever decades you experience in a different country, you start building a new life, but you never forget what you experience, in the other place. I mean, I lived more years in Argentina than in America. And then on the other hand, the contradictions, as you pointed, my oldest son is called Michael. In Spanish it's Miguel. We didn't name him Miguel, we named him Michael, embracing our new culture. So I could say that I'm a man of contradictions, and you hold both worlds together. And yes, I cheer for the Argentinian soccer. That's perhaps the only thing I do for Argentina. And I don't know, I never questioned myself that.
Right.
Never questioned myself that. It's like, I don't know, it's like, Alisa, I was more or less your age when I moved to America. It's like, there are so many things that even if you move to Belgium, for example, you're never going to lose, and so it's part of you. And yeah.
So, do you think what insights? Just and then Dan and Michelle, what do you take about Joseph's neshama? He's he's a slave kid. He's his prisoner. He's now second in command. He's an immigrant. He's a Jew, Hebrew in Egypt. He has these two sons, whose mother is Egyptian aristocrat. He's got all these multiple identities that we all have in different ways. Is his neshama at peace or not at peace?
Well, interesting you mentioned this. Since we are talking about soccer, the best player in Argentina is called Messi, all right? And I'm a big fan of him. I think he's fantastic. Anyways, so Messi's story is fascinating. He's 35, and for the last 25 years, he lived in Spain, all right? He left Argentina when he was 10 to play for Barcelona, and they offered him to play for the Spanish team, national team. He refused. He says, I'm Argentinian. He only lived there 10 years. And then many Argentinians, when he wasn't winning tournaments, they criticized him. They said, he's not really Argentinian. He's a Spaniard. And why do we bother with this guy? And he insisted. Finally, he won a few trophies. But he's also a man of contradictions. I mean, it's like he's struggling. His neshama is struggling. He's not Jewish, but his neshama is struggling. And I think it's the case of Joseph. It's like my roots, my upbringing, my father, and my conflict, situation with my brothers. I don't forget who I am.
So let me ask the three of you who were born in America, um, is your neshama at peace in terms of your American self, your secular self, your Jewish self, or do you have the kinds of your own versions of these kinds of contradictions built into the names of Ephraim and Manasseh?
I was thinking about the text here. So it says Pharaoh gave Yosef the name Tzaf Paneach, but and then he says, go to Joseph. Does Joseph ever think of himself by that name? It's like Yaakov in Israel. When does Yaakov in Israel think of when does he think of himself as this name or the other name? The other thing is that that it says that Joseph called his sons Ephraim and Manasseh, but do we know what they were known in Egypt? Were they known by Egyptian names, and did they have this complex cross identity as well? And to go to your question about thinking about identity, do I think of myself as Chaim Pension, or do I think of myself as Daniel? And there are times that my Jewish identity is stronger than my American identity, and there are times that it's the opposite. So this seems to be always a play on not only on identity but on loyalties in my own personal life.
Dan, one of the tropes that all of us encounter with our members at Temple Emmanuel is that one time when people really want their Hebrew name mentioned is when they're would like a Mishaberach, right? So they don't want the Mishaberach for John Doe. They want the Mishaberach for Yonatan, Ben Reuven, Miriam, right? And what do you think is at that? That all of a sudden, I'm not John Doe, I am Yonatan, Ben Reuven, Miriam. When you pray to God for my healing now, pray in my Hebrew name. What do you think that's about?
I think, first of all, I think that many people are very connected to tradition, and this is an age-old tradition of using the Hebrew name. And I guess also it has to do with what I just said, the idea of identity, that you have, that I think many American Jews, no matter how secular they become in many ways, still identify themselves at least half and half, but at minimum anyway. But I also have some people have said to me, why don't you just use the English names, or why can't you just say, so and so and so and so? I said, well, because this is what people ask me.
Right.
And you're right, it's exactly the point of the power of that alternate identity is very strong.
So Michelle and Elisa, are your neshamas at peace with your multiple selves, or not? Do you have your own version of the Joseph contradiction?
I mean, I think it depends what day you ask. This morning, walking to shul, my West Coast internal self was hurting. I do have to say. But, each of us have pieces of ourselves that are at play with others at all points in time. And I find it strange. My children are Newton kids. They're landlocked. They don't know what it is to walk along the ocean in the morning when you're going to school. And it's sort of an experience that I don't share, that I have planted deep in my soul, that I am not planting moving forward. But there are other things that that the culture here just feels so right and so concrete, the way that people are thinkers here and real intellectuals. And I always felt a little out of step and out of place when I was growing up in a place where the sunshine was more important than the ideas that might be discussed. And so I think there are, each of us both fit and don't fit into the various identities that we carry. And so I think if you are not conflicted at some point in your life, then you're not thinking or feeling hard enough.
Thank you, Michelle. Elisa, my friend, what about you?
You're around Hazan, so talk us about that. Rav or Hazan?
Yeah, I couldn't pick. It's interesting for me. I think and maybe because Solomon and I are talking about names all the time now, I really identify with this. I was at the Taste of Shabbat Alive dinner last night, and I was hanging out with some parents, and they're like, whatever name you're thinking of, just go to Starbucks and order a coffee with that name and see what they write. And
It's good advice.
but then I was like, I have never in my life gotten a coffee cup with my name on it at Starbucks. And I think I'm okay. Like, I've made it out okay. The first time that ever happened for me was when I went to Israel, and I remember going and getting my coffee, and they spelled my name right, and I was like, whoa, I belong here. You know me. But it's a really interesting question of, I think, as parents, you want to set your child up to belong and to feel belonging in as many places as possible. And the way that we as Jews do that is really interesting. Sometimes we do that by making sure our children have very Jewish names, so that wherever they go, they'll know they're Jewish, and everyone else will know they're Jewish, and they'll feel a sense of belonging to the Jewish people. And sometimes we do that by giving our children an English name and a Hebrew name, right? So they have a belonging that works here and a belonging that works here, and they don't have to compromise, and we don't have to have people trying to make a ch sound, or, any of the sounds that we have that they just can't do. We don't have to, no, they can just easily fit wherever they go. And I think that the truth is, whoever you are, we all have that longing to always belong, and that deep sense that we never really quite do.
Well, I want to thank you guys. I want to close with a question that was actually asked to me this week. A ma'aseh shahaya, a thing that really happened, which was a Jew by choice who recently joined the Jewish people, said to me, if there was one book that I should read now to kind of ground me in the Jewish people and the Jewish people story, what book would you recommend? Okay? So, if there's one book for a Jew by choice, or one book for a Jew, period, new or old, lifetime or just joined, what's a book that, it's the end of December, that you'd want me to read that would ground me to the story? Any takers? The Torah, okay. That's a very original idea, Dan. I just want to applaud, Dan, I want to applaud your risk-taking. You are just always on the cutting edge, taking risks. That's amazing. Any other takers?
You didn't say Talmud.
History of Argentinian soccer.
Okay. Lionel Messi biography.
Tell us what book you love, Wes.
So what I recommended was Israel, a concise one-volume history by Danny Gordis. I just think that is essential required reading, because the book is about, like, when I think of, I'm 61, to me, the story of Israel is my complexity, because I just completely identify with the incredible heroism of the story. When you read the story, it's just so. And I'm teaching it in my sisterhood class, and what's really remarkable, and there's 40 to 50 learners every week who are like lifetime Hadassah people who have been to Israel 100 times. And one of the things that you hear every week is, oh my God, I didn't know that. Oh my God, I didn't know that. Oh my God, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Like the actual founding of the state, how it came to be that Israel exists, I did not know. And most of the 50 people on the phone, on the Zoom did not know. And it's a story of incredible heroism, and it's also a story of incredible hatred that formed the state. All of the massacres and the pogroms, and even, like, who knew that after 45 and after the Holocaust was over, the Jews who survived had yet more hatred and more persecution. Like, they went back to Poland and were killed, and they were thrown into DP camps, and Israelis and Jews who were refugees from Hitler, who were trying to get to Israel. English soldiers, British soldiers, they're supposedly the good guys, right? Used rifle butts and were crushing their skulls. Right, all this. Who knew? I never knew this. Right, so that story draws me. Like, that's my story. I want to cast my lot with that story, but I don't want to live in Israel. But I want to go to Israel, and now I'm really concerned about what's happening in Israel. So I would say, to be a Jew is not to have a peaceful neshama. We learned that last week. Yaakov Yisrael. To be a Jew is to wrestle, and the story that I want to wrestle with is the story of the people of Israel and the land of Israel. Elias, you got a song for us?
I have a song. I have to say that when I go to Starbucks, I say Eli. Alisa, I say Eli at Starbucks because it's what? Can you spell that for me? What? Anyways.
Oh, well.
So this is a song from the show Joseph, all right, that is much more fitting than to sing something about anti-Semitism. All right, so let's do it together. I close my eyes, throw back the curtain to see for certain what I thought I knew. Far, far away, someone was weeping, but the world was sleeping. Any dream will do. I wore my coat with golden lining, bright colors shining, wonderful and new. And in the east, the dawn was breaking, and the world was waking. Any dream will do. A crash of drums, a flash of light, my golden coat flew out of sight. The colors fade into the darkness, I was left alone. May I return to the beginning, the light is dreaming, and the dream is true. The world and I, we are still waiting, still hesitating. Any dream will do.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. And by the way, we're going to be on break until January 7th. Shabbat Shalom.